IVM.
I want to thank Intel for supporting our show. Do you remember last year when we spoke about how the Intel vPro platform is built for business? Well, I'm glad to say we've kicked it up a notch. That's right, Intel is back with a new and improved version of the platform. The new Intel vPro platform lets you do more of what you want and less of what you don't. So it's better for you and for your IT teams, who really are the backbone of keeping your work-from-home experience easy and enjoyable. I can safely say that the new vPro platform gives you more enterprise efficiency with less constraints. Visit intel.in/morewithvpro, that's VPRO, to discover how you can get more done with less waiting. If you're listening on the IVM Podcast Android app, click the link that's visible to you now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today, in the final episode of our long China week, we've got a special guest who's been part of the broader Takshashila family. She's the host of the awesome podcast States of Anarchy, and she's currently studying at Peking University in Beijing. She's a Yenching Scholar. She's studying over there in the stream of IR and political science. Hamsini, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Manoj. It's so nice to be back to a Takshashila podcast.
And what's interesting is that the roles are reversed. I remember my first engagement with Takshashila was when you had spoken to me on a podcast.
Well, it's nice. It's nice that these things are changing this way.
Yes. No, it's awesome. I want to sort of talk to you about so many things since you went to China last year. That was your first trip to the country. But before you went over there, you were already studying the language here in India. You were already conducting research into Chinese foreign affairs and domestic policy. So you were familiar with the country when you went over there for the first time last year. So I want to begin by first sort of talking to you about when you landed in Beijing. What were the sort of thoughts that you carried about, what were your perceptions about the country and about what you were going to experience? Did some of those perceptions get shattered by reality, or were they reconfirmed by realities? What were the sort of surprising elements that you encountered, given that there are so many myths about how we sort of Indians perceive China and how also Chinese perceive India?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because it brings back so many things. You're right. Before I went to China, I was researching at Takshashila. I was learning Chinese. I actually have a master's from Manipal University where my master's thesis was also on China. So I'd been working on China for about 4 to 5 years before I decided to go there. And I'd also done my research, I'd read books by like Anurag Vishwanath, Pallavi Basu. They're all women who've written about living in China as Indian women. And so I'd done my meticulous research, but I was also very scared. You hear all of these stereotypes like, oh, you're vegetarian, you're never going to be able to eat anything in China. And I was like, okay, I need to figure out how I'm going to do this, So I go with like yoga bars packed and, like dosa batter powder and, very like typical Indian things. So I go there and I was actually very, very surprised. Like on the food count, for example, I discovered like a plethora of food that was very widely available. Many of my friends are vegan. So that was very, very nice to know. The second, I think, major myth that was at least dispelled for me is that China is a very big part of my daily life in India. And it's not because I'm just like going out and researching on it. It's also in phones and in products and, it's present everywhere. And for some reason, I assumed that because China is such a big part of my life in India, India would be a reasonable part of my life in China. And to my, complete surprise, I found myself, like all of my Chinese friends, I was possibly one of the first Indians that they'd ever spoken to. In my batch, we had 3 Indians and they were like, oh, wow, we've not really interacted much with Indians. So they wanted to talk to me about like the state of women, which they'd heard a lot about. They wanted me to talk to them about poverty. And that's when I understood that this was the image of India that they had. There was this poor country where women are not very safe. And that was, I guess, like something that I had to just wrap my head around.
It's interesting, right? I mean, I remember even when I was there, the issue of women's safety was something, and it has a lot to do with the fact that the Chinese tend to travel in big tour groups, and women tend to travel quite freely over there. And that's one of the reasons why that's a thing that they think about. Because I remember my colleagues used to tell me that we'd like to go and visit India, but this is a concern. And I used to be like, well, it's a concern. I agree, but you need to be sensible, safe, follow certain protocols, and it's not. And just make sure that you realize that it's not like how life is here. But that doesn't mean that it's dangerous that way. But it's a sort of a difficult sort of argument to make, right?
It is. And it was especially difficult for me, Manoj, because, for the first time in a very long time, I stopped looking over my shoulder. I was walking out to a grocery store at 3 a.m. It didn't really matter what time it was. There would always be someone on the street. And this basic fear that I had, always as an Indian woman, like glance over your shoulder, be hyper aware of what you're doing, where you are, the people around you. That sort of relaxed. And it was fascinating for me because it was not only me who felt that way. I had students, students in my cohort were also from countries all over the world. We're from 127 countries almost. And a lot of them also said that they'd felt safer in China than they did in places even in Europe and America. And that was surprising to me personally. I don't know, how true it is and if we can gauge that. But for example, I was backpacking through Yunnan with a Spanish friend of mine. And it was about 8 or 9 p.m. and we wanted to find out like a bus for the next day. And so she said, okay, let's just go to the bus depot and we'll find out. And so I go with her to the bus depot and she starts walking around and, it's dark. There is no light except for us and our phone camera, like flashlights. There are only buses. It's a parking lot. There is nobody there. And I was like, we need to go now. And like having an utter meltdown. Whereas she was like, listen, nothing is going to happen. The most that will happen is if people see us here, they'll guide us. They might offer us a meal. So like, don't worry about it.
That is absolutely fascinating, and it's really refreshing, right? I mean, you don't get to hear these perspectives about the country. And whenever you hear them, the whole thought is that, oh, this is propaganda. But let's move from that to talking about the university. You're studying at PKU, which is sort of, one of the top universities in China. You're studying politics and IR in China. Now, for all the time that I lived there, I didn't necessarily, I would have loved to have been at university because I would love to have sort of tested the hypothesis of what is it that they are teaching in terms of political science theory. Sitting outside, we talk about things like, the vassal state system, Tianxia, son of heaven, and those things being normalized within Chinese society and political culture. What's the sort of sense that you've gotten learning at the university over there? How do they approach international affairs? How do they approach political science?
Yeah, really great things to think about, primarily because I've had sort of the same conversations with people, right, who take I'm not saying that China is like the best place in the world or that it has no issues or something like that. But I think my experience has had positives and negatives. And the university there, I think we have to acknowledge that Beida or Peking University is one of the best universities in the world. And they've sort of made this concentrated effort to leverage themselves as possibly the best university in Asia. Like their closest competitors would be across the road, Tsinghua University or NUS in Singapore. And I can see why Beida is really good. Their curriculum does have a lot of concepts from China and the US. Their curriculum, I would say, is heavily influenced by what is taught in American universities. So you have the fundamentals of politics taught the exact same way. The fundamentals of IR taught the exact same way. So you do the same realism, liberalism, constructivism, and then you talk a little bit about how China looks at the world. And I've taken some classes from the School of International Studies, which have been phenomenal. And I will say, there are a lot of people who ask me about like academic freedoms and things like that. And what I will say is that a lot of the discussions that we have, everyone in the room, particularly when there are international students, are hyper aware that they are presenting an image of a country. But I think this is also relatively freer. the international students have an easier time in Beta, in PKU, and this is something that the domestic students have long protested against, actually, because they get better rooms, they get better facilities, and they get more freedoms to talk about things. But that is only one side of the coin. My Mandarin is not very good. I've studied it for 2.5 years, but it really isn't that good. And some of my friends who've taken classes in Chinese tell me that those classes are absolutely phenomenal. And they're phenomenal because when you're teaching in Chinese, you're subject to far less scrutiny, to be honest. And also, I think it's easier for them to grasp some concepts, even if they are concepts from America or from Europe. So for me, studying at Beta was very interesting because you would obviously do like a Chinese perspective, look at Chinese issues, but a lot of the lenses that we were using were lenses of political economy that I've used before in India or that I'd studied before in my first master's. And that was natural. It seemed just like a natural part of education.
See, this is what I find really interesting, right? I mean, firstly, this is really counterintuitive that there's more freedom and more sort of open discourse in Chinese language as opposed to in English, because I would have organically thought that it was the other way around. That when you're teaching in Chinese, it would be far more constrained because you're speaking to a wider audience, a wider domestic audience also, which may be which you may not want to have influenced a certain way. So that's firstly really interesting to sort of think about. The other thing is that I remember having a conversation in the office with we had Akash Singh Rathod visit some time back, over a year or so. And I remember having this conversation in office with him about the need for, other disciplines, other countries to have their own sense of their own frameworks for social science disciplines. And I was thinking about this because a couple of days ago, the 29th of June, there was a commentary in the People's Daily which spoke about something very similar. Like, we need social sciences with Chinese characteristics. We need intellectual constructs which represent our way of approaching the world. That's because when, for example, if say the Chinese today talk about, yes, we will rise, but we will not be a hegemonist in the sort of classic sense of, how the US is or whatever. But the language doesn't exist to sort of say what they want to say. Mm-hmm. Now, sitting outside, when we look at it from a realistic lens, from the lens of realism, we may say, yes, you're saying all that, but look, this is how the real game works. And, if you have enough power is the currency, that's how you will play. But for them to even communicate what they may want to even be communicating as simple propaganda, it's really difficult because you don't have the language of the field in itself, which represents how you think. And so are those some of the things about, developing a system of social sciences which is somewhat detached from what are seen as sort of very Western constructs, whether it's realism, liberalism, so on and so forth?
Yeah. One of the reasons that Peking University is particularly interesting is that it prides itself on being the birthplace of, social systems thinking in China. So the Chinese think about it. Beta is where, the May 4th movement started. It's where scientific thinking was first embraced. It's where you had a lot of radical student movements who eventually, came up with ideas of communism. This is where, works from all over the world were translated into Chinese. And therefore, I think the way that Peking University sees itself in that sense is that it's a pioneer of social systems. And so the classes in English, again, are more constrained because the teachers who are teaching them will have to watch what they're saying because they are presenting a narrative. And therefore, they don't want to present a narrative that would at some point contradict what a bureaucrat or a politician might feel. Whereas I think there is also this dichotomy where there are these cases of Chinese students reporting professors, right, of like going against the grain and giving accounts that are not in line with the Communist Party's accounts. And those have happened in Peking University and those have happened in Tsinghua. But I think the reason that they have happened is because Chinese classrooms, at least in, the best university in China, allow for a certain amount of pushing you to think differently or allow you a certain leeway in how you're going to be thinking about the world rather than just parroting sort of the same things over and over again.
All right. I'm going to sort of ask you a little bit more about the point of sort of academic freedom. You've sort of spoken about how professors would end up behaving, but from the point of view of students, you spoke about the international nature of your classroom, which is in many ways representative of the growing sort of soft power clout of China in itself. Mm-hmm. The fact that it's able to attract quality students from across different parts of the world, and it still remains a significant exporter of students, yet it's increasingly sort of importing a lot of students also. And that's a massive gain from, I mean, if you just think of it from a soft power perspective, yes, but also from a, in some ways from a broader, deeper perspective that, if elites in different countries end up studying in China, they sort of, the familiarity, the comfort levels, all those are very different from what they were, say, 20 years ago. So it's a deeper sort of thing than just attractive soft power. I wanted to firstly push on how have your interactions with students been? How, for the lack of a better word, how free have they been, not just with Chinese students and colleagues, but also other international colleagues? How free are you to discuss issues that may be extremely contentious? For example, say Tiananmen Square or Hong Kong.
So I think one of the things that surprised me actually was how international the university was. I forgot, that Beijing was cosmopolitan. And so you often had a lot of professors who were very big. You'd have like Yan Xuetong or, Mearsheimer came down to Tsinghua, and Peking University students are allowed to go over and listen to them at any point. So that was very cool. But I think the other thing was also, right at the beginning of the semester, every year they organize this huge international cultural festival where, people from all over the world come, they put performances, music, dance, and it's great. And, and this is possibly the only place where like North Korea has a student stall, right? So it was very, very just fascinating to see.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, it was. It really was wonderful. I think with talking to other students, right? Like one of the nicest things that I had in my program is that we actually had this thing called China in Transition, where every week about 8 or 9 of us, and they divided us in a way that we had people from all over. So we had like a bunch of Asians, we had people from Latin America, from North America, from Europe, and from Africa, and it was geographically distributed so that we would have enough people from all over the world. And every single week we would talk about something. We would talk about Xi Jinping, we would talk about Hong Kong. We didn't talk about Tiananmen Square, at least when I was there. But what was interesting is that I've had a very good experience with this, talking to international students about this. International students feel a lot more free, I think, talking to each other. With Chinese students, I think there is this thing that they don't like discussing politics all that much. And I think that's just something that I learned to respect. I had a lot of people who were like, oh, look, like Chinese students don't comment on these things. But I think Chinese students are brought up in a way that they don't encourage political discussions with people who they don't particularly know. So with friends who I am very close to, with Chinese friends who I am very close to, I have spoken about these subjects with, but with others, I haven't. So I've spoken about Xinjiang, I've spoken about Hong Kong, and these are, good topics to talk to Chinese people about. But in order to do so, you need to have a certain level of trust. This is not like India, where like every second person you go to and be like, "Tujhe Modi ji pasand hai," and then they'll have like an opinion about Africa, right? So I just think maybe the nature of discourse.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point to make, right? Yeah, you need to, in that society, it's trust really matters before you can have some of these conversations, because the way people have been brought up, the way people think about these things. I mean, I remember before I had moved to Beijing, and when I was traveling in different parts of the country, and I used to ask people about some of these things, the common answer that I used to get was politics is for people in Beijing to worry about. We don't need to worry about it. But let's now get to sort of India. last couple of years, we've seen lots of friction. At the last 6 weeks, we've seen even more friction. But there was this sort of sense of, we need to get to know each other much more people to people contact and that sort of stuff. Three Idiots, Dangal, soft power, all of that. What's been your sense of how people in Beijing, your fellow students, how do they view India, and just as a society firstly, and then from a political standpoint, where does sort of, in your sense, given you're studying politics and IR in China, where does India fit into the Chinese worldview from what you've heard from them?
Yeah, so I think something that you and I have spoken about before, Manoj, is that, we just elevate India in our own eyes, and that's not necessarily true in China. I think, on the other hand, wherever I went, people were very, very interested in knowing who I was and what kind of background I came from. I did a little bit of traveling. I traveled to Inner Mongolia. I traveled to Yunnan during my limited time there. And there, people really wanted to know what my parents were like. Was India religious? How safe was it? How did I feel about arranged marriage? They had lots of questions about Indian ways of life, how Indians looked at Buddhism, and I sort of did my best to answer those questions. There were also more fundamental questions. I've had conversations where Chinese students would say, hey, China has developed so much because they have Mandarin, and that's a single uniting language, and all of the admin work is done in Mandarin. And why doesn't India want that? And, it's very easy in India to explain this concept to somebody who has a similar background from you. But I think answering those questions and justifying and saying this is why, India needs 22 different national languages and possibly more federalization was something that I had to enunciate for myself and make a compelling case for. And so I was re-examining a lot of social truths, a lot of political truths that I just took for granted, and still committing to them. And I think that was very interesting for me because on a very basic level, it made me rethink my political beliefs. But I think it was good that I was having those conversations. The other thing, of course, is, whenever I would go in a cab, someone would pull out Indian music. The cab driver was like, would you know this song? Would you know this song? And my Hindi is, newly found over the last 10 years. So I have no idea what 80s music this dude is playing. But yeah,
Did you happen to get Raj Kapoor songs?
Of course.
Because that's what I used to get.
Of course. And often I would have to Shazam it because my knowledge of Hindi music is negligent. Okay. So it was, but that was always interesting. Something that I'd actually expected when I went there was a certain degree of racism. I expected certain levels of discrimination, but I was very surprised to see that was not there. The other difference for me as an Indian was that bureaucracy was just very, very efficient. There was, in the sense that there is bureaucracy, you have to go stand in a lot of lines, okay? And the whole experience can be very Kafkaesque. You're wondering what you're doing there, hours have passed, all of that. But, when it's actually your turn and you're in front of the person, it takes all of 2 minutes. If you followed sort of protocol and things like that. So it's like India in the sense that you need a stamp on the right side of the corner. You need to follow this, you need to follow that. But I think since I'm very used to the Indian way of doing things and being turned down by government offices multiple times, I had a very easy ride in China. Whereas people from America who hadn't had to deal with this level of scrutiny in their lives before were just this is so useless. Why do passport size photos need to be like this? How does it matter what background is there? All of those small things that you wouldn't imagine crop up otherwise.
Yeah, no, I completely echo that, particularly on things like backgrounds and sizes of photographs. I think I've also had the exact same experiences there. From a political point of view, how does India sort of fit into their worldview? You've spoken about the social aspect of it, but how does India fit into their worldview from your understanding?
From a political point of view, honestly, I think that most people, if they think about India, they think of it sort of as hand in glove with the United States. they often think that, the US is using India as a bait. And that's possibly the view that I've come up most against. Politically, they look at India. Sometimes there are conversations about, how does religion influence politics, about nationalism, and things like that. But again, I'm going to stress that for the Chinese, the Indians are very far away. India is very, very far away.
Which is interesting that you say that, right? Given that we are neighbors, we have a massive border, which is very problematic. But let's get to sort of the final sort of bit of thoughts that I had in terms of what's happening right now between India and China. Mm-hmm. Firstly, I mean, I'm sure that the pandemic has had an impact on you going back to the university. So what have you heard about how they're coping over there with regard to the opening of schools and universities? Because they've opened in the last couple of months, but they've also then shut down in different places. Mm-hmm. So firstly, what's your sense of how they've been dealing with that? And secondly, with regard to what's happening with India and China right now, it's developing fluid, serious situation. How do you see this sort of playing out broadly? Firstly, your sense of what's happening on the ground, and how do you see that from a political perspective? And secondly, what sort of an impact do you think this has long-term in terms of what the agenda has been for the last couple of years of people-to-people engagement?
What's happening on the ground is that the Chinese universities immediately switched to online classes, right? I was supposed to go back on February 17th, and this date is very clear in my head because I was there end of Jan, and I planned to travel more. I was backpacking, and then immediately, I was told that I couldn't go back to campus if I didn't reach there in a day. And thankfully, I managed to do it. But I got out of the country just when all of the travel bans were being enforced. I honestly assumed that this was going to last all of 3 weeks. And this was just like one more thing that like Western people were afraid about because they didn't have immunity. But that hasn't been true. And I think over the last 6 months, most Chinese universities have switched to online classes. Graduating students were allowed to go back. All of the international students are still stuck on campuses, and they're not allowed to leave campuses. And I think what most universities are planning for the next semester is to also hold them online, possibly. At least international students will be the last students to go back. That is something that I'm pretty certain of. With domestic students, it's easier that students in provincial universities go back before students in large universities like Peking University or Tsinghua or Fudan. But, if you're in Qingdao or if you're in Ningbo or something, then I think it's easier. You will go back to school quicker. I think what matters is not when universities reopen, but when China lifts its ban on visas. China has now suspended all residential visas. So my visa, for example, I can't use it right now, even if flights were flying. So I think until China lifts that suspension of visas, we're not going to see resumption of travel to China anytime soon. And the suspension of visa lies with Homeland, right? So that's going to be a big decision. And I think until October, or at least the rest of the year, it doesn't seem likely that international students will be going back.
All right. And in terms of the sort of the politics that's been playing out in the last 6 to 8 weeks between India and China, and how do you sort of see that impacting not just your sense of where the relationship is going between those two countries, but how does that impact this broader agenda that we've been talking about for the last couple of years about people-to-people engagement?
I think Indians are very good at sensing like business opportunities, right? And over the last couple of years, whether or not the government intended it to be, a lot more Indians were traveling to China. The number of Indian medical students were going up. All of that was on the rise. Which is why the banning of WeChat particularly was something that sort of disturbed me. Because if you're someone who's ever lived in China or is planning to return to China, and most, Indian students, for example, and most Indian residents, I think, have returned for the pandemic. So if you're in India and you have networks and contacts in China, then the banning of WeChat means that you lose access to all of them. And sure, you can use a VPN, but it's important to remember that WeChat is not a messaging app, right? I get official university communication on WeChat. I've had an examination on WeChat. I've had bills paid. I check my bank account balance, all of that stuff on WeChat. And what I think this does is signals to Indians that China is not the place to go to. So what I think will happen is that the number of students who are applying to go to university to China next year will naturally decline. And the Indian government can say, hey, this is good, Indians should study in India. But I think this, again, it limits an Indian's consumer choice, right? If a Chinese university is cheap and good, then I should have the choice to go study there. Whereas I think the banning of these apps, but more broadly, the border tensions will really deter Indians from going to China. I think from the other side, it could also, again, coming back to the apps, we could see like limited investment in India's tech scene. And I see a lot of these moves reflecting on Indians. Of course, I have a personal stake in sort of going back to China and completing my degree. But what I'm afraid of it on a larger level, Manoj, is how this reflects on Indian scholarship of China. If you and we want to study China, but we don't have access to Chinese people, then how do we study the country, and how do we do research that gives policymakers informed opinions? And that is sort of what worries me the most.
Yeah, no, I think that makes absolute sense. I mean, the fact that, because if you need to understand what the other side is thinking, what the other side is doing, you need to have access to modes where they are communicating. Yeah, no, I totally sort of echo that also. All right, so I think this has been a fascinating conversation. It's been a fascinating insight from your personal journey, but also from your sense of how what's developing between the broader relationship. And I really hope that you can actually continue your degree seamlessly while this goes on. I mean, and I hope that things also settle down at the border so that, some of what's been built over the last couple of years can actually continue to do that, because that's really important. Thank you so much, Hamsini, for joining us.
Thanks, Manoj. Thank you for having me.
This has been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you, folks, for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. Really, really fun week, and I think that you guys should definitely check out some of the stuff we did. So we had Shifa Mehta, who is the host of the show Smile India, on the Paperback Podcast. Really fun thing. On Edges and Sledges, our hosts had an episode just amongst themselves. No guests this time. Really fun show with lots of cool banter. I think you'll enjoy that quite a bit. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet had Shrishti Bell on. Shrishti is the head of Netflix in India, and I think you'll really enjoy that conversation as well. Also, do check out Uncle Please Sit. Joel and Tushar had Anuya Chatarkar on. Anuya hosts the popular YouTube channel Books on Toast. And don't forget others of your old favorites like The Habit Coach, Football Should Ball, All Things Policy. All of them are doing a great job during this pandemic, and you should definitely check them out. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story-sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives, and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Storysellers for personal stories, analysis, and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.